This lecture deals with the 1920s, from 1920 to 1932. In this lecture, we have 5 learning outcomes. First, we'll identify who benefited and who suffered in the new consumer society of the 1920s. Second, we'll identify in what ways the government promoted business interests in the 1920s. Third, we'll analyze why the protection of civil liberties gained importance in the 1920s. Fourth, we'll explain the major flashpoints between fundamentalism and pluralism in the 1920s. And fifth, we'll analyze the causes of the Great Depression and how effective the government's responses were by 1932. So our first learning outcome is identified at the top of the screen. We're talking about who benefited and who suffered in the new consumer society of the 1920s. The 1920s really were a decade of prosperity. Business was booming. Calvin Coolidge, who was president in the 1920s, famously said that the business of America was business. And the automobile was really the backbone of economic growth during this time period. It was our leading economic sector, and it had a lot of spread effects. It stimulated the expansion of steel, of rubber, of oil production, of road construction, and of a lot of other sectors of the economy. It's also in the 1920s when American multinational corporations began to extend their reach throughout the world. It's here where we see the dollar replacing the British pound as the most important currency. And American companies will be producing 85% of the world's cars and 40% of its manufactured goods. So this consumer society is going to forever change the American way of life and how Americans defined themselves. Consumer goods of all kinds will be proliferating, and they will be marketed by salespeople and by advertisers as ways of promoting Americans' psychological desires and everyday needs. In other words, you will be happy if you buy this particular good. This is the key to happiness. And a lot of this stuff these consumer goods are going to be bought on credit for the first time, which is also going to be changing kind of traditional American values, which stress things like, thrift and patience. And now it's all about instant gratification. And that kind of helped to undermine traditional values in America. These new consumer goods will also be altering American daily life. Things like the telephone. You no longer have to go to somebody's house to talk to them. You can stay in your own house and pick up the phone. Things like washing machines. Now, these weren't the washing machines like we have today where I throw the clothes in and press the button. They look like what you see there on the screen. These giant machines that were still insane amounts of work compared to what we do today. But it's a lot better than having to take your clothes down to the river with a scrub board and do this all by hand. So we begin to see Americans' life, the way they live their everyday life and what they expect from their everyday life begin to change. And you see this even being kind of played up in consumer goods, things like Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola markets itself as a symbol of American life in its advertising in the 1920s, celebrating this consumer society. Americans will also be spending more and more of their income on leisure activities than they ever had before, doing things like vacations, going to movies, going to sporting events. And this is really a continuation of what we saw beginning to happen in the Gilded Age with things like dance halls and Nickelodeons. That continues into the 1920s, where leisure too becomes something that is consumed. Inventions like radios and phonographs are going to bring mass entertainment into American homes. And this helps to spread celebrity culture, which, for better or worse, is still with us now. People like Charles Lindbergh, who made the first transatlantic flight. He's like the superstar of his time. Babe Ruth, the baseball player. These all become kind of national celebrities, whereas before the radio, you wouldn't have had a national culture. You would have had kind of local celebrities, but you wouldn't have had somebody famous unless they were, say, like the president all across the country. That changes because of things like the radio. And so, as more Americans are going to be accepting this idea of going into debt to purchase consumer goods, those traditional ideals of thrift, of self denial, change. And we start to become more a society that's based on consumption of goods, right, of material possessions, as well as kind of focusing on instant gratification. Because this is an era of business and business is doing very well, the gains are not going to be equally shared. While everybody is kind of rising in the 1920s, businesses are definitely rising more. And so, in order to kind of prevent the backlash that we saw in the Gilded Age, businesses began to put a lot of emphasis on their image. And this is when things like public relations get started. And in the 1920s, it largely works. Business people like Henry Ford, engineers like Herbert Hoover are celebrated in the 1920s as kind of these cultural heroes. And we begin to see numerous firms establishing public relations departments in order to justify their current practices and in order to counteract the labor movement's narrative that this is not free, this is not fair. And overall, in the 1920s, they are very, very successful at this. 1930s is a different story. If you need to pause this video to catch up on something, please do so now. So while in general, most people are doing better in the 1920s, prosperity had its limits because the fruits of increased production were very unequally distributed. Corporate profits are going to be growing at twice the rate of wages. And so corporations and the rich are benefiting twice as much as your ordinary person is. And we're beginning to see this kind of concentration of wealth into the hands of the few continue. So, for example, in the 1920s, only a handful of firms are going to be dominating the economy. 1% of banks controlled half of all financial resources in the United States. And by 1929, an estimated 40% of the population still lived in poverty. Now, today we're not much better off. Today, a recent study showed that 40% of middle-class people could not afford what are considered middle-class basics in today's world. And so we're very close to this kind of unequal distribution of wealth that we saw in the 1920s, right before the Great Depression hits, again in today's world. Farmers also will not be sharing in the prosperity of the decade. Prior to the 1920s, farmers are at the height of their prosperity during World War I because they're producing food, feeding not just the United States, but feeding the United States Army and feeding our allies, feeding France, feeding Britain, feeding, for a while, the Russia, the Soviet Union and the White Army there. But after World War I, after Europe gets back on its feet, we begin to see this steady decline in farmers' prosperity. And part of the reason for this was because of overproduction, because of the war, and because of new technology. Essentially what happened was all these new machines, you can see there some of the new farm machinery that they're using, farmers were able to produce more and more food than ever before. But it follows the laws of supply and demand to a point, because when there's a lot of something out there, you pay less money for it. That's why when it's strawberry season, strawberries are cheap. And if you try to buy strawberries in January, they're more expensive. But this also kind of hits a roadblock of inelasticity, because with food, at a certain point, you only buy so much food. I mean, if you won the lottery today, you wouldn't go to Sam's Club and demand all the bread they had, right? Your bread consumption is probably going to stay more or less the same, regardless of how much money you have. Now, of course, if you were starving and didn't have any money, yeah, then your consumption changes. But if your basic bread needs are already being met, you're not going to go out and buy significantly more bread just because you have more money in your pocket and just because it's cheap. And so this is what we see playing out in the 1920s. Food is plentiful, but because it's plentiful, the price keeps falling and falling and falling. And even though the price keeps falling and falling and falling, Americans are not necessarily buying more of it because you only eat so much bread. And so the new technology that we see being used on farms is also going to be transforming farming forever. Now we're relying a lot less on the small family farm, and we see a lot more of the factory farms, these gigantic farms that are run just like factories, that are run like businesses. And these farms are going to be employing migrant laborers and paying them very poorly. Part of this is made possible by aid from the federal government. The federal government will be sponsoring and paying for major irrigation projects that made the arid Southwest farmable. So remember that next time you hear people complain about government handouts, right? The big agribusiness wouldn't exist without a major government handout creating these immigration projects. And as they do this, small farmers are going to become under increasing more pressure, and we're going to see these, especially Southwest farms, rely mostly on immigrant labor from Mexico, as immigration from labor by this point has been effectively shut off. And so one of the reasons why business is doing so well is because the labor movement kind of falls into disarray and loses its status in American life in the 1920s. Basically, businesses are going to appropriate the rhetoric of Americanism and industrial freedom. And so labor loses that word freedom in its fight against business. And instead, businesses are going to be grabbing this Americanism rhetoric. And they're going to be using it as weapons against labor unions, essentially equating labor demands for, greater workplace autonomy, greater say in the business, better hours, as un-American, as not part of our civic society, as unfree. And so we're going to see, for example, in 1919, there were labor upsurges trying to keep the gains that labor had made during World War I. Labor will be broken. A lot of the wartime labor protections that workers had won during World War I will be dismantled, and business will kind of continue on making money at the expense of workers. That being said, in the 1920s, briefly, we do begin to see something emerge called welfare capitalism. And this was more for those businesses that were concerned about their PR. And it helps to explain why the United States took a different track than Europe does during this time period. Welfare capitalism can be defined as a moral, socially conscious kind of business leadership that paid attention to the, quote, humane factor. And so welfare capitalism is when businesses began to provide health insurance to their workers, pensions to their workers, sick time to their workers, this kind of thing. And it's the route that the United States went because after the First World War, the sacrifices were so great and the upheaval was so great that people in Europe, for example, began demanding these basic social safety net protections from their governments. And this is why in Europe, governments stepped in and began to provide old age pensions. They began to provide health insurance, things like that. The United States, American workers began to demand these things too, but the private sector stepped in and began doing these things with varying degrees of generosity and success. And so there wasn't this compulsion for the government to step in and do it because in many places the private industry was. Keep in mind, in many places the private industry was not either, but because labor had been effectively broken, there was no one really to push back against that. We also began to see employers embracing what was called the American Plan. The American Plan is also sometimes called the open shop. And what this meant was they got laws passed in various states requiring open shop as opposed to closed shop. So here's what this means. Say you worked at a company and there was a union at the company. If it was a closed shop, if you wanted to work at that company, you have to join the union. That's what closed shop means. If there's a union, you have to join it if you want to work there. Now, unions love this, right? Because whenever you join a union, you have to pay union dues. Some of it comes out of your check every month, and it goes to finance the leadership and strikes and everything else. And it also gives the unions more power, right? Because they have more numbers, and it kind of equals that playing field. Employers, of course, hate the closed shop because it does make labor unions more powerful. Well, the open shop says if there's a labor union at a place, the employee can choose whether to join or not join. And what that did was it weakened labor unions because most people only see the union dues coming out of their check, right? Most people don't want to pay for it. And so a lot of people would opt not to join the union. Now, the labor unions hated this, right? Because number one, it weakens their power and their money. But number two, they argued that it was unfair because whether or not you were in the union, you benefited from union activities. So if the labor union went in and negotiated an extra week of vacation, that extra week of vacation would go to everybody, if you were in the union or not. And so unions argue, hey, this isn't fair. They're getting benefits and not paying for it. But of course, business owners love the open shop because they know that this weakens the power of the labor union and workers will not have as much power and as much say. Employers will also continue to embrace strike breakers. So when their workers go on strike, particularly if it's an unskilled kind of line of work, they'll just bring in other people to take their jobs away from them. And of course, they also continue to engage in blacklisting. So if there was say it was the steel industry, and there was a steel worker who they knew was pro-union and was advocating for unions, his employer would fire him, and he would contact all the other steel mills around and say, don't hire Jane Doe. She's a problem. She's gonna try to, bring in a union, and Jane Doe would be unable to get a job anywhere. So during the 1920s, because of all these things, labor will lose over 2 million members. And American workers, while they are benefiting from the general prosperity, they aren't benefiting nearly as much as corporations are, and they're going to be steadily, as the decade progresses, begin to lose ground. If you need to pause this video to catch up, you may do so now. Women are also going to be experiencing a different kind of freedom in the 1920s than previously. So remember that by this point, women's suffrage has passed. And the suffrage movement had linked together a lot of different kind of groups of women that may or may not have had much else in common. So once that achievement of suffrage in 1920 had been achieved, that bond of unity between the various activists broke down. And so eventually what emerges in the 1920s is this competing conception of women's freedom. What does it mean for a woman to be free? And on the one hand, you kind of have traditionalists who argued that women's freedom was bound up in this concept of motherhood and of being a wife, that being able to stay home and have children and take care of your children was the essence of what it meant to be free if you were a woman. And competing with that conception of freedom was the side that argued for women's individual autonomy and the right to work, the right to have a job and keep a job and make her own decisions. And these two things were very much at odds with each other. So one very important group that we see continuing the fight is Alice Paul's National Women's Party, the NWP. The National Women's Party, led by Alice Paul, had been instrumental in the passage of the 19th Amendment. Now that the 19th Amendment had been passed, they turned their attention to what was called the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA. And the ERA it was a constitutional amendment that wanted to eliminate legal distinctions, quote, on account of sex, unquote. And so this was designed to try to combat things like women getting half the wages that men were getting for the same job. And they argued that women now needed equal rights to citizenship. Yes, they're voting, but in so many other areas, women were being denied basic rights. For example, Harvard didn't accept women, not till the 1970s. You couldn't go to Harvard. You couldn't open up a bank account without your husband's signature. Things like that. And so the Equal Rights Amendment was supposed to eliminate all this. That being said, there were a lot of critics against the Equal Rights Amendment. Others, particularly the people who believed that freedom was bound up in ideas of motherhood, worried that the Equal Rights Amendment would undo legislation that was currently protecting women and protecting mothers, that all that would disappear. And so on the face of it, something that seems pretty non-controversial, right, that women will not be discriminated against, becomes highly fraught with this kind of personal is political conceptions of freedom. We also see in the 1920s this idea of female liberation resurfacing as a lifestyle, and it becomes the stuff of advertising and of mass entertainment. And you see this especially with the ideas of, sexual liberation. Sexual freedom is now going to be kind of identified with individual autonomy or with personal rebellion. And of course, nothing exemplified this more than the flapper. The flapper was that single woman who has short hair, she's wearing a short skirt, she's drinking in public, she's smoking in public, she's partying, she is not bound up in the traditional inhibitions that her mother and her grandmother are. And of course, the flapper, as we think about her, thanks to our 21st century media, existed, but not the way we think of her, right? You see here a picture of Alice Paul. Alice Paul's the definition of a flapper, right? She doesn't look the way you think she does. And keep in mind that very few people went full out flapper, right? Very few of us in our everyday lives go full out Beyonce. Most of us borrow a little bit here, a little bit there. And so it was in the 1920s, right? They might have cut their hair, but they were still going to dress traditionally, or maybe they liked the new dresses, but they still kept their hair long. I mean, stuff like that. Also keep in mind when we say short skirt, we mean mid-calf, right? This is the 1920s, not the 1970s. So they aren't wearing mini skirts here. In any event, women's pursuit of pleasure becomes a very powerful marketing tool. Because remember, most women were expected to be the consumers. And so if you were a married woman, you were doing the shopping for your household, for example. And so this pursuit of pleasure becomes a very powerful marketing tool, and it continues to this day. Open any magazine and just count how many of the ads in it are geared at women's consumption. Everything from makeup to shampoo to jewelry to purses and everything else. Sex also becomes a powerful marketing tool. And you see this kind of everywhere in movies, right? There's going to be kind of playing up the sex appeal in advertisements and everything else. So while there is this kind of new definition of female liberation and freedom out there floating around, keep in mind that this new freedom that women are toying with typically only lasted while they were single. Once a woman got married, she was no longer socially, at least, entitled to these new ideas of freedom. They were expected to now go inside the home. They were expected to adhere to those traditional ideas of freedom, of becoming a housewife, of becoming a mother. And of course, if you were a poor woman, that is going to be less possible, but that was still the ideal and what was expected of at least good women to do. If you need to pause this video, you may do so now. We're now going to talk about ways in which the government promoted business interests in the 1920s. One reason we know about kind of the changing way that people are viewing their life and their society and leisure time in the 1920s is because of a landmark study published in 1929 called Middletown. Middletown was the sociological study by Robert and Helen Lind, a husband and wife team, and they studied life in Muncie, Indiana. And instead of using that name, they called it Middletown. And it was supposed to just kind of be laying out what is life like for middle class Americans in kind of middle America. And one of the things that we see pointed out in Middletown and reflected in overall American culture was that leisure and consumption are now replacing politics as a focus of public concern. In the Gilded Age, people spent a vast majority of their time concerned about politics. They're reading newspapers, they're attending speeches, they're attending civic organizations. That's what most of their time is going to be spent on. Now in the 1920s, that's shifting, and they're paying less and less attention to politics and instead focusing more and more of their attention on leisure and on consumption. And if voter turnout in the 1920s is going to decline dramatically. Less than 50% of people eligible to vote voted in 1924. And of course, today, especially when you get into midterm elections, it's down in the 30s, right? 30% of people. And so this is going to continue on into the modern day era. Think about your own life. Unless you're a, quote, political junkie, how much time do you spend thinking about politics, attending school board meetings or city council meetings or Laredo College Board of Trustee meetings, compared to how often did you go to the movies? How often did you go to the mall? How often did you go to Starbucks? You can see where your focus is. And that shift begins to happen in the 1920s, and of course it only accelerates into the modern day. Government policies in the 1920s also reflected this kind of pro-business ethos, echoing back to the Gilded Age. In many ways, they're trying to undo a lot of the progressive era, just pretend that didn't happen, and go back and embrace those pro-business policies of the Gilded Age. And so in the 1920s, we're going to see lower taxes. And again, the greatest con that the rich and corporations ever did was convince middle-class people that taxes were bad, right? Taxes are bad for rich people and for corporations because they don't want to pay them. But taxes are generally good for middle and lower class people because they go to fund things that help middle class and lower class people. Things like roads. The rich don't need good roads. They can take a railroad. They can fly in a private plane. They can take a helicopter. Things like public schools. The rich could afford private schools and private tutors, right? Healthcare. The rich can afford healthcare. Lower class people can't. And so these lower taxes are definitely going to be helping business, but not helping the middle and the lower classes. There's also higher tariffs in the 1920s, very reflective of the Trump administration who's raising tariffs on stuff. High tariffs, again, very good for American businesses because it means that they can now compete with cheaper goods overseas. But bad for consumers because it's not the country that pays the tariff, it's you that pays the tariff in the price of higher goods. So remember how tariffs work. This is a tax on imports. So say you imported, say there was a company that sold bottles of water, an American company that sold bottles of water. They could sell their water for $1. And then a company or country X, Wakanda, if you will, can also sell water, but because of their labor laws, because of their resources, whatever, they can sell the same quality of water for 50 cents. Well, if there's no tariff, that's really good for me, the consumer, because I can buy water for 50 cents. That's really cheap. That's good for me. But American businesses don't like it. They're like, I'm losing business to this company from Wakanda. That's not good. So now the government slaps on a tariff. They say, okay, any imports coming from Wakanda, there's going to be a dollar tariff on it. Well, Wakanda doesn't pay that. They pass it on to me. So now when I go to buy water, here's the American water for $1, and here's the water from Wakanda that's $1.50. Well, now I have to pay 50 cents more for water to buy the American water than I would have had to otherwise. And the American corporation reaps the benefits, right? So high tariffs, very pro-business, very bad for consumers. And of course, they're also going to be pursuing anti-union activities, laws, and policies, once again, hurting the power of American workers. And the Supreme Court of the United States, that's the abbreviation for SCOTUS, right? SCOTUS is going to be conservative during this time period. And you're going to see SCOTUS rolling back some of the labor protections that we see in the progressive era. So, for example, Adkins versus Children's Hospital, which was in the progressive era, there was a law that guaranteed a minimum wage for women that gets repudiated in Mueller v. Oregon. And the argument was that women now shouldn't have a law guaranteeing a minimum wage because they could vote. And because they could vote, they have the same workplace, quote, freedom as men, right? Going back to that liberty of contract idea. So if you need to pause and catch up on something, you may do so now. The 1920s were also an incredibly corrupt time in government. The Harding administration in particular is one of the most corrupt in American history. Until recently, I honestly do think the Trump administration is giving them a run for their money when the history is written about it. Regardless, Harding ran on this slogan, return to normalcy. And what he meant by normalcy was to go back to the pre-progressive era, Gilded Age, business-friendly policies. That, according to Harding, was what was, quote, normal, right? And so this is what he's running on, return to normalcy, forget that progressive era stuff, back to what America used to be. And he wins. So obviously, particularly following World War I, wherein the progressives sold the American people that this war was a good idea, we see a repudiation of progressivism, largely because of that disillusionment of the war. That being said, Harding is going to be surrounding himself with cronies who will be using their offices for personal gain. And so corruption is rampant in the Harding administration. And here on the cartoon, you could see just kind of some of the scandals that were going on. Probably the most famous scandal, not the only scandal, but one of the most famous scandals to emerge from the Harding administration was called the Teapot Dome scandal. The Teapot Dome was the name of a petroleum reserve, and it was on public lands, so lands owned by the United States. Now, Congress had passed a law that prohibited drilling on public lands. And of course, the oil companies didn't like this. The oil companies desperately wanted to go drilling in the Teapot Dome. So the person that manages public lands in the United States is the Secretary of the Interior. And the Secretary of the Interior under Harding was a man named Albert Fall. And Albert Fall was just outright taking bribes, right? The oil companies were giving him stocks, they were giving him cash, right, over $500,000 in cash. They're even buying him cattle for his ranch, and he allows them to drill in the Teapot Dome in spite of this law saying that you couldn't. And so Albert Fall has the distinguished honor of being the first cabinet secretary to serve time in prison for his actions in office. Won't be the last. So this was just an example of the kind of corruption that we see in the Harding administration and this kind of very cozy attitude with the business and government, right? This kind of you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. Now, Harding actually dies in office. Technically, it's a heart attack. Some historians speculate that maybe his wife murdered him because, I don't know, there was a mistress and a love child. She didn't seem sad. I'll leave it up to you, but that's the historical gossip. But the official cause of death was he had a heart attack. So he dies in 1923. After Harding dies, his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, will take over. And Coolidge runs for re-election in 1924 and gets re-elected. And Coolidge kind of exemplified this kind of Yankee honesty. He came off as kind of a real milk and cookies kind of guy in public. But in private, he was actually not a very nice person, mean as a snack. Mean as a snake is how one person I read described him. And he also was, the term I guess he would have chose was non-activist. A term we would have used would be lazy, right? He actually did nothing. If he could help it, he did absolutely nothing. So he was a very, very hands-off president. Unless it specifically helped business, he did not do a dang thing. Now, he ran against Robert La Follette, who was this famous progressive reformer from Wisconsin. And La Follette ran on a progressive platform in 1924, and he gets annihilated by Coolidge. He only wins 1/6 of the vote, which tells you that in the 1920s, most Americans, well, at least the ones that are voting, and that's less and less of them, are fully on board with the business ideas, right? Are fully repudiating progressivism at this point. Now, in foreign affairs, we also see this close working relationship between business and government. America begins moving away from this internationalism that was stressed under Woodrow Wilson. That's why we get into the First World War mainly in the first place, right? Being able to influence the peace afterwards. We begin moving away from that and instead moving towards isolationism, this kind of fortress America. We're going to mind our own business. And if we do act, we're going to do it unilaterally. So there's this emphasis on unilateral American action, mainly designed to increase American exports and investment opportunities overseas. So when we are engaging with the world, it's for business purposes, right? To further American businesses, not to spread democracy, nothing like that. The one kind of exception to this was something called the Washington Naval Arms Conference in 1922. And this was an important conference because it set naval arms limits between the United States, Japan, and Great Britain primarily, which helped to end kind of this naval arms race that was going on. But aside from that, America is largely going to be staying out of international organizations. For example, the United States never joins the League of Nations, despite it being the quote-unquote peacekeeping organization of the world, and despite it being Woodrow Wilson's baby. Now, the foreign policy that is being conducted during this time period is oftentimes not being done by the government, but instead is being done through private economic relationships. So, for example, Germany during this time period is being crushed by reparations payments that they're trying to make to England and to France following the First World War. And the United States government is only going to be providing limited assistance to them. Instead, it's going to be private American banks that are going to be loaning Germany large sums of money. And so a lot of the foreign policy being done during this time period is being done through private economic relationships rather than through governmental actions. The big exception to this is the Western Hemisphere. The Western Hemisphere remains America's backyard, and America still reserved the right to kind of run it, to be the policeman of the area, and to keep our guys in charge. And so the government will continue to dispatch soldiers into the Caribbean, into South America, into Central America, whenever a change in government threatened America's economic interests. And again, it's economic interests that we were concerned about. We were not concerned about human rights. We were not concerned about democracy. We were concerned that America's business interests might be threatened. And a good example of this is what happens in Nicaragua, and which, by the way, Nicaragua is still not happy about, right? So in 1927 in Nicaragua, there was a nationalist revolt led by a general named Augusto Cesar Sandino. And This revolt was largely against American intervention in Nicaragua. America had been propping up a dictator who was very friendly to American interests, but not a nice guy, right? Dictators typically aren't. And Sandino really became a symbol of resistance to American domination. And even to this day, he is a national hero in Nicaragua. And it would probably come as a surprise to a lot of Americans that they were viewed in such a negative light in some of these countries. It's not something that American textbooks and American media like to dwell on, right? In any event, Sandino was pretty hostile to American intervention and American domination of the economy. And so America will send down Marines who will enter the country, and they will establish a national guard under the command of General Anastasio Somoza. And in 1934, Somoza, with the assistance of the United States, the backing of the United States, will assassinate Sandino and will seize power. And the Somoza family would rule that country for the next 45 years as a very anti-human rights dictatorship that was very friendly to American interests, right? And American aid is going to be propping up their regime. And they will stay in power until his son is overthrown in 1979 by a popular movement calling themselves the Sandinistas after Sandino. So if you need to pause this video to catch up on something, you may do so now. We're now going to analyze why the protection of civil liberties gained importance in the 1920s. So in the 1920s, progressives seemed to lose their way following the dislocation of World War I. Many of them used to believe that an active federal government enhanced the enjoyment of freedom. But as we saw in World War I, their actions didn't necessarily always reflect that. World War I saw a lot of repression against freedom of speech, things like the Sedition Act, the Espionage Act, things like prohibition, which certainly didn't enhance freedom of the individual if you can't drink. And of course, all these pro-business policies that we see in the 1920s are going to be undercutting that argument that the government enhanced freedom. And so with this repression, it leads to this new appreciation of civil liberties. Civil liberties are rights an individual may assert even against democratic majorities, right? Even if you're in the minority, for example, you still have a right to free speech without government repression. That's an example of a civil liberty. And these now become essential elements of American freedom, whereas before, the emphasis wasn't so much on them, or at least whether or not they are, in fact, rights are even in flux. And so we begin in the 1920s to see this new idea emerge of the new freedom of the individual. And of course, to begin with that freedom of the individual, it begins first and foremost with legal protection for the freedom of speech. Because of course, freedom of speech corresponds very closely to freedom of thought. If I can say what I want, it probably means I can think what I want. Now, as we just talked about, World War I saw extreme wartime repression, Sedition Act, the Espionage Act, and this wartime repression is going to continue into the 1920s. And we're going to see the government repressing a lot of things that went against what they considered to be traditional American values or against business interests. So for example, sexual themes were subjected to rigorous censorship. The post office, for example, could confiscate material that was being sent through the mail that they considered to be lewd. And so there came to be this term called banned in Boston, because Boston, banned a lot of books with sexual or controversial themes, and it became this kind of term of ridicule among upholders of artistic freedom. We also saw the Hays Code adopted by Hollywood. This was a sporadically enforced set of guidelines that prohibited movies from depicting nudity, long kisses, adultery, and it also barred scripts that portrayed clergymen in a negative light or criminals sympathetically. And again, it's kind of sporadically enforced depending on who, what, where, why. But the fact that they felt like they needed to enforce this kind of code at all tells you a lot about what they're trying to do and how society is changing. And in reaction to a lot of this, we see what's called the lost generation of writers. And in this context, it's referred to American artists and writers who immigrated from America to Paris. And it's there that they're kind of hanging out in cafes and writing and producing art. Many of them were very disillusioned by the experience of World War I, and they're kind of trying to figure things out, people like Hemingway. So you kind of see this repression and this backlash, and that's kind of what the 1920s is a lot about. In response to this kind of repression of freedom of speech and things like that, we have the American Civil Liberties Union formed, the ACLU. And the ACLU is still an extremely important organization. It's still around today. It was established in 1920, and it fought for freedom of speech and this new idea of a right to privacy, the idea that the government shouldn't be in your bedroom, right? The government shouldn't be telling you what you can or can't read, for example. And so even to this day, the ACLU continues to fight against what they see as infringements of freedom of speech or right to privacy. For example, when there was child separation at the border, it was the ACLU that came in and began challenging that policy in court case. When the new Trump administration came into office and issued the first quote-unquote Muslim ban that banned the people from certain countries from being allowed into the country, it was the ACLU that immediately challenged that. So they're still around to this day. Now, prior to this, the Supreme Court had addressed the concept of civil liberties in rulings that seemed to limit political dissent. And of course, the landmark case there was Schneck v. United States. It was in Schneck where the court ruled that your freedom of speech was not absolute, that in situations where there was a clear and present danger, Congress had special responsibilities and special powers. And Oliver Wendell Holmes famously gave the line, "You cannot yell fire in a crowded theater." And so that's where they were. But slowly, we will begin to see the tide start turning in the 1920s away from the court backing these kind of repressive ideas and more towards protecting the ideas of freedom of speech. And Oliver Wendell Holmes and Louis Brandeis are the ones that are going to begin speaking up for this freedom. And so this idea of freedom of speech now began to evolve beyond mere political expression into things like art, right? And so slowly in the 1920s, we're going to see the tide of civil liberties decisions begin turning the other way, to becoming less repressive and more permissive. If you need to pause this video to catch up on something, you can do so now. We'll now explain the major flashpoints between fundamentalism and pluralism in the 1920s. So fundamentalists have always been around, right? And when we say fundamentalists, what we're probably thinking about are evangelical Protestants. These were people who believed in traditional values and considered the Bible to be 100% true, God's word. So because of that, evangelical Protestants tend to be fairly intolerant of other beliefs and lifestyles, which makes sense, right? If your reading of the Bible you consider to be 100% true, anybody deviating from that is a sin against God, and you can't do that, right? So it kind of makes sense logically why they do this, but it makes them kind of strict in what they believe and very inflexible in dealing with others. So many evangelical Protestants in the 1920s were beginning to feel very threatened by the decline of traditional values, as well as by the increased visibility of other religions, particularly of Catholicism and Judaism. And those two religions are gaining an ascendancy because of immigration. So this kind of evangelical backlash and nativism oftentimes went hand in hand in the United States. And during the Trump administration, you see that as well. Trump's biggest supporters are evangelical Protestants, and Trump's biggest issue that he ran on was we're going to build a wall. These two things go hand in hand. I'm not saying that everybody who voted for Trump is a nativist, but I'm saying that there is a correlation in history as to evangelicalism and nativism. Historically, they go hand in hand, and we still see that trend continuing today. So, Protestants were also upset by, evangelical Protestants were also upset by what were called Protestant modernists. Modernists sought to integrate science and religion and to adapt their Christianity to the new culture. So, a good example of this is evolution, right? Evangelical Protestants said, no, evolution is not true. God made man exactly the way it says in the book of Genesis, period, right? Modernists would say, well, we do believe that evolution happened, but that's because that's how God designed it. So it wasn't this simple story of, God took dust and made Adam. God made humans, but he did it by having humans evolve out of these earlier kind of life forms, right? So that's an example of this. Now, evangelical Protestants were convinced that the literal truth of the Bible formed the basis of Christian beliefs. And so fundamentalists will begin launching campaigns to rid Protestant denominations of modernism, as well as to combat new individual freedoms. So it will be they who are leading the campaigns against women's liberation, for example, against teaching evolution in school, who are for prohibition, this kind of thing. And a good example of one of the leaders of this movement was Billy Sunday. Billy Sunday was a professional baseball player who became a revivalist preacher and kind of a champion of this cause in the 1920s. Fundamentalists, unsurprisingly, supported prohibition, and they came up against many others who viewed this as a violation of individual freedom. Now, despite myths in modern-day media, prohibition was actually very effectively, if selectively, enforced. This was effective, and it does have long-ranging consequences. It forever lowers American consumption of alcohol. To this day, Americans consume less alcohol because prohibition happened than Americans consumed before prohibition. So where prohibition was enforced, it was enforced very well. It was enforced mostly in immigrant neighborhoods, in poor neighborhoods, in black communities. And of course, it was typically ignored amongst wealthy and white people, right? But what this does do is it leads to the building of a lot of federal prisons. Because if you broke prohibition, of course, you're breaking federal law and off to jail you go. And some historians argue that this is what laid the foundation for the war on drugs, as well as laid the seeds for the mass incarceration that we see today, particularly of black and brown bodies. Prohibition also raised these very serious questions about the expansion of federal authority, right? How big a role should the government be playing in people's everyday lives, as well as the wisdom of legislating morality. Should the government be telling me what is the moral or immoral thing to do? And this was especially acute among the Democratic Party. It will end up splitting the Democratic Party into, quote, wet Democrats and dry Democrats, people who were for prohibition and against prohibition. That being said, prohibition proved highly profitable for some. Think of the mafia who get their start as bootleggers, bringing in alcohol. Think about people who ran illegal speakeasies. And it also led to kind of mass corruption on kind of every level of government. So if you need to pause this video to catch up on something, you can do so now. Perhaps nothing more effectively illustrates this kind of flashpoint between fundamentalism and modernism than the Scopes trial. So John Scopes was a high school biology teacher in Dayton, Tennessee, and there was a law in Tennessee that made it illegal to teach evolution in public schools. which of course was ridiculous because the textbook that they used actually had evolution in it. So John Scopes is a high school teacher. He thinks that this law is stupid, and so he is going to intentionally break it with the intention of seeing it challenged. And so in 1925, he teaches evolution and he gets arrested. So he now goes on trial. And technically, the trial is supposed to be, did John Scopes teach evolution or not, right? That's what this trial's technically about, but that's not what this trial is really about. The Scopes trial really reflected this tension between the two American definitions of freedom that we see in conflict with each other during this time period. Because fundamentalist Christians, who had their strongest support in rural areas of the South and the West, believed in this idea of moral liberty. Moral liberty was this kind of voluntary adherence to time-honored religious beliefs, and they felt perfectly comfortable with the government enforcing them. So for fundamentalist Christians, it was okay for the government to enforce their version of morality. Now, Scopes defenders disagreed with this. For Scopes defenders, freedom to them meant above all the right to independent thought and to individual self-expression. And that would mean being able to teach evolution in school. And you can choose whether or not you want to agree with it, right? But you would have the freedom to teach that. So this trial quickly becomes what's called a monkey trial, partly because it's a play on this idea of evolution, right? That we evolved from apes. Partly because it became this circus, right? You can see there a photograph of the trial where it's being held in front of a live audience. They're playing it live over the radio, so the entire country is watching this and listening to this. It's, reality TV before reality TV. And we have really heavy hitters come in to defend this. So the renowned labor lawyer Clarence Darrow is going to come in and defend Scopes, who's kind of the superstar lawyer of his time. And William Jennings Bryan, who ran for president twice, he's going to be aiding the prosecution. So again, this is much bigger than just some little guy in a town in Tennessee nobody's heard of teaching evolution. This becomes this kind of referendum on the role that religion should be playing in our public square. And so Darrow was going to be at one point examining Bryan as an expert on the Bible. He calls him to the stand. If you've watched enough Law and Order, you know that's weird. You don't call opposing counsel to testify for you. But Bryan was basically, harassed and to have shown to know absolutely nothing about modern science. And when Darrow would kind of pound these sarcastic questions at him about the Bible, Bryan really had no answer for them. So even though Scopes was found guilty, though later it's overturned on a technicality, even though he loses, in public opinion, he wins, right? Because most people listened to Bryan and were like, this guy's nuts. And so after the trial, fundamentalists retreated for many years from these battles over public education, and instead of trying to enforce their views onto public schools, we began to see them building their own schools and building their own colleges and making them private, where they could stay, number one, white, and number two, where they could teach what they want. And you see this especially in places like Liberty University, for example, is a good example of a fundamentalist college, where it's not accredited, for example, because they can kind of teach what they want. And also the homeschooling movement largely is a continuation of this. But even to this day in public school, evolution still sparks these debates, right? When I went to high school in Kansas, there was a big to-do about maybe we should teach both creationism and evolution in public school, and there was this big fight about it. Of course, the question then you have to ask is, which creationism? Are we going to teach the Hindu one, the Zoroastrian one, the Sikh one? Which one? Which makes it a little more complicated. But at this point, I want to play a short video clip of kind of this video over the Scopes trial.
Dayton, Tennessee, July 10th, 1925. It was the day a 24-year-old teacher named John Thomas Scopes went on trial for teaching Darwin's theory of evolution in a public school classroom.
John Scopes was new to town. He had just come down from Illinois, where he grew up, and he came down as the new football coach. But he also taught general science. Scopes' indictment became front-page news around the country as soon as it happened.
Hundreds of people streamed into the Ray County Courthouse. It was the hottest summer anyone could remember. In the courtroom, said a reporter, it felt like a blast furnace.
This was the very first trial in American history that was covered by the broadcast media.
I think that the only thing they were down here for was to propound the theory of evolution, and this was a great place to do it.
Evolution was about to go on trial with an unusual cast of characters. A group of civic boosters trying to put their little town on the map. A judge who believed he'd been chosen by God. A prosecution attorney who spent his evenings drinking bootleg liquor with the defense. And a chimpanzee named Joe Mendy.
He would have a little hat on. He had a suit on with a vest. And, of course, we were always excited about seeing Joe.
At the center of it all, two of the most colorful and controversial men in America. During the 8-day trial, they would fight an epic battle. A duel over science and religion. Faith and agnosticism. The Book of Darwin and the Book of Genesis.
Okay, so if you need to pause this video, you may do so now. So as more and more immigrants are pouring into the United States, they're bringing with them different cultures, different languages, different religions, and few features of urban life seemed more alien to small-town native-born Protestants than these immigrant populations and cultures. And they began to react to it because it was different, and it scared them, and it caused anxiety, and they didn't like it. And this is just human nature. It didn't matter that these immigrants were quote-unquote white. They were different, and so there is a reaction. And so we begin to see states, on one level, states doing things to try to counter immigrants. For example, in 1922, Oregon required all students to attend public schools with the idea of Americanizing them, making them forget their immigrant roots, forget their foreign languages, and assimilate into the mainstream. But where state action wasn't enough to combat these changes that are taking place in American society, you have illegal, extra-legal means also arising in an attempt to stop these vast changes that are taking place. And to that end, we see the Ku Klux Klan re-emerge. So historians sometimes call this the second Klan. The first Klan, of course, emerged during Reconstruction in the 1860s and the 1870s with the intent of stopping the racial changes and racial integration that the federal government was attempting to create during Reconstruction. After Reconstruction ends and the South falls into Jim Crow, there was less of a need for the Klan, so it just kind of disappeared. But now in 1925, in the 1920s, it's going to be coming back into vogue. So the Klan was officially reborn in Atlanta in 1915 after the lynching of a man named Leo Frank. Leo Frank was a Jewish factory manager, and he was accused of killing a teenage girl. And so note who the Klan is going after. It's no longer just African Americans. It also included new groups. So by the time we get to the mid-1920s, the Ku Klux Klan was no longer just a Southern institution, but it had spread to the North and it had spread to the West. And at its height of power, it had over 3 million members. And so the Klan argued that American civilization was being endangered. And it was being endangered by African Americans. It was being endangered by immigrants, especially Jews and Catholics. It was being endangered by the forces of feminism, by unions, by, quote, immorality that threatened, quote, individual liberty. So you can read that as things that are against the white Anglo-Saxon middle-class mainstream, Protestant mainstream. So the Klan, you can think of it as a roller coaster. It gets really, really powerful, really, really fast, and then almost as equally fast it comes crashing down. Because the Klan's influence faded after 1925 when its leader in Indiana was convicted of assaulting a young woman. And so the reason why the Klan is rejected by most Americans is because most Americans objected to the violence that the Klan used. I mean, being racist or against these new forces was, acceptable for most Americans, but most Americans drew the line at violence and did not like the violence that the Klan used. And so kind of as quickly as it rose, it also fell. If you need to pause this video, you can do so now. So immigration is definitely one of these flashpoints in the 1920s, and it's testing the bounds of race, and it's testing the bounds of tolerance that Americans had. And so the 1920s, there's going to be a big backlash against immigration, and we see a fundamental change in immigration policy take place. Prior to the 1920s, there was this kind of assumption that all white people, however we're defining white people, keep in mind that that's a socially constructed and contested term, but however they're defining white people at the moment who wanted to become citizens eventually could. There was this idea that they were assimilatable and that they would eventually just kind of blend into the Anglo-Saxon Protestant mainstream. But in 1924, that starts to change. In 1924, Congress permanently limited immigration for Europeans and outright banned it for Asians. And so now, beginning in 1924, there were immigration quotas. People could come in according to national origin quotas that tended to limit Southern and Eastern Europeans from coming in. And the net effect of this is going to be that 85% of immigrants will now be from Northern and Western Europe, the places where the earlier immigrants had come from: England, Ireland, Scotland, France, Germany, these kinds of places. That didn't apply to everybody though, right? There were kind of exemptions to this. In order to satisfy the demands of those large farmers in California who were relying on those seasonal Mexican migrant laborers, the 1924 law established zero limits on immigration from the Western Hemisphere. So while we're cutting off immigration from Asia, while we're limiting immigration from Europe, we're allowing it kind of to free flow from this hemisphere in order to satisfy the demands of big business. The law also now established a new category of, quote, illegal alien, and a new mechanism for enforcing immigration laws, and this is when the Border Patrol was created. Now, the term first referred mainly to Southern and Eastern Europeans. That's what an illegal alien was. It wasn't yet applied to people from Mexico or South or Central America. This was mostly to Southern and Eastern Europeans. And the Border Patrol was mostly on the northern border for those Europeans who tried to sneak across the border from Canada or, to a lesser extent, from Mexico. By the 1920s, political leaders of both the North and the South had also seemed to tacitly agree to the relegation of African Americans to second-class citizens. So now that there's kind of this established underclass, it's not hard to see how you could add people to that underclass. And so the immigration policy that emerges in the 1920s now is resting on this biological definition of the ideal population. And so the 1924 immigration law reflected this progressive desire, kind of carrying into the 1920s, to kind of improve the quality of democratic citizenship and to employ scientific methods to set public policy. And so we see kind of pseudoscience being used to these ends with regard to race. So by this, we see these kind of pseudoscientific assumptions about the superiority and the inferiority of particular races. One way this was done by, IQ tests of people entering the armies, for example. These tests were incredibly culturally biased, so they're highly problematic, but they're going to be using it to prove that, hey, look, native-born people score better than immigrants. Therefore, obviously, native-born people are superior to immigrants or black or pick whoever, right? Of course, if I'm writing the test, I can make it so that my group passes and your group fails pretty easily, right? But this, of course, harkens back to social Darwinism. These ideas are nothing new, but they're going to be using this kind of pseudoscience to make it more legitimate. And this concept of race as a basis for public policy, keep in mind, is lacking any rational foundation. There is no, there's no textbook, there's no rationale for this other than this is what we want to do. And this is admitted by the Supreme Court in the 1923 Supreme Court decision, United States versus Bhagat Singh Thind in 1923. In this court case, there was an Indian-born World War II vet. He asserted that he was a pure Aryan because, guess what? That's where the Aryans are technically from. And so because he was a pure Aryan, he was actually white. And therefore, he could become a U.S. citizen because the rule was white people could become U.S. citizens. And, of course, this guy did not look white. He had brown skin. So the Supreme Court said that, quote, white was not a scientific concept at all, but part of a, quote, common speech to be interpreted with the understanding of the common man, unquote. In other words, it is what we say it is. It's not based on anything else. And so in today's language, what we would say is that race is socially constructed, right? That it doesn't actually exist. It is what we say it is. It has no actual meaning. That doesn't mean that how you identify yourself as what race you identify yourself as or others identify you as doesn't have a meaningful impact on your life. But as far as a concept, it's something that we have made up. Now, there is pushback to this anti-immigrant, racist, nativist impulse that we see in the 1920s. We do see many Americans going the opposite way and attempting to promote tolerance. Immigrant groups, for example, asserted the validity of cultural diversity, and they identified toleration of differences as kind of the essence of American freedom. And so rather than kind of giving into this demand to assimilate, instead they're going to be reinventing themselves as, quote, ethnic Americans, and they'll be demanding an equal share of the nation's life, but with this kind of additional right to remain culturally distinct, this idea that I can be a hyphen, right? I can be a German hyphen American. I can retain this ethnicity and still be just as American, even if I'm not the same type of American as you, is the argument they are making with varying degrees of success. And an example of this is, for example, Catholics who will now decide, okay, we'll learn English, but they will continue to send their children to parochial schools. That's an example of trying to bridge this gap. You also have the Anti-Defamation League form. The Anti-Defamation League is still around today, and it lobbied for laws prohibiting discrimination against immigrants by employers, colleges, and also government agencies. And the Supreme Court seemed to be on the side of tolerance. In landmark decisions, the Supreme Court is going to be striking down laws that try to enforce this Americanization on people. For example, in Pierce versus Society of Sister in 1925, The court struck down Oregon's law on public schools. Oregon had passed that law requiring all children to go to public schools to try to Americanize them. The court struck that down. They said that parents could send their kids to parochial schools if they want to. And in Meyer versus Nebraska in 1923, the court struck down laws prohibiting teaching in foreign languages. There were these laws passed that you could only teach in English. The court struck that down and said, no, you could teach anything you want. And so in these cases, we see the Supreme Court interpreting the 14th Amendment in a new way, and in a really important way. Now the 14th Amendment is including the right to, quote, marry, establish a home, and bring up children, quote, and practice the religion as one chooses without interference of the state. What that means then is that it's giving pluralism a constitutional foundation. This idea that you can speak whatever language you want. You can raise your children however you want. You can practice whatever religion you want without the state interfering with you. Because of these court cases and the 14th Amendment, you have that protection. If you need to pause this video to catch up on something, you may do so now. African Americans, too, in the 1920s are not just taking their relegation to second-class citizenship laying down. There is also pushback from the African American community to their status. So in the background here is something called the Great Migration. During World War I, because there was such a demand for labor, we're going to see thousands, and after World War II, millions of African Americans leaving the Jim Crow South and moving north into northern cities to work in war industries. And of course, they end up staying there. And so when they move north, while there isn't de jure segregation, there is de facto segregation, which is just as stringently enforced. And so African Americans in the North oftentimes ended up living in ghettos. Now, ghettos are bad for all the reasons we know ghettos are bad, right? There's less opportunity, there's poorer infrastructure, there's less jobs, there's less public resources being developed to safety. So for all these reasons, ghettos are bad. But there was also a positive side to these northern ghettos, and that is that there is finally a space where African Americans were relatively free of white supervision, wherein they could kind of develop their own culture free of this outside interference. In the South, when 95% of African Americans were living in the South, they're being watched like a hawk. And deviating from their quote-unquote place oftentimes would prompt a very swift and perhaps violent backlash from the surrounding white community. But in these northern ghettos, most of the time, white people aren't hanging out in there, right? Sometimes they did what was called slumming, when whites would visit Harlem's dance halls and jazz clubs, etc. But for the most part, these are black spaces, which meant that there was an opportunity to develop a black culture kind of free from this white interference. So the 1920s is going to witness this upsurge of black self-consciousness, especially in the North's urban ghettos. And New York's Harlem gained an international reputation as the capital of Black America. And so while this is going to be celebrated in many places, keep in mind what the real Harlem was. It had very widespread poverty. People who lived there were confined to low-skilled, low-paid jobs. They were forced to pay high rent for kind of crappy apartments. But that being said, again, it was this space. And so what emerges from there is what historians call the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance was a cultural and literary flowering in art and literature in the 1920s, because Harlem was home to a very vibrant black cultural community. People like Countee Cullen, Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, and they began to use this term, the new Negro. Now, in your papers and with your friends, please do not call them Negroes, right? It conjures up images of, repression and kind of negative feelings. It's not the N word, right? But it's not a nice word either. But the New Negro movement, and I'm using it here in its historical context, in art meant the rejection of established stereotypes and instead a search for Black values to put into place, right? And in many ways, this was a reaction against Booker T. Washington's accommodationist strategy. Remember, Booker T. Washington was a Black leader who argued that African Americans should accommodate themselves to segregation and disenfranchisement until they could kind of prove their economic self-worth. This is a reaction against that. And so many are going to be we're going to see many writers going back to the roots of the Black experience. This becomes a type of protest against the way African Americans are being treated. But keep in mind what it is and what it's not. This is not a militant movement yet. This is not a confrontational movement yet. This is mostly a cultural thing. So they're not out there doing protests. They're not out there doing sit-ins like we see in the 50s and the 60s. That comes later. This is a cultural thing. You also have the NAACP still around, and the NAACP is simultaneously doing legal challenges, right? So they're fighting discrimination and racism in court. And Harlem Renaissance is taking it on the cultural aspect. But we, in the 1920s, don't really have a political arm of this movement yet. That will come later. So if you need to pause this video to catch up on something, please do so now. We're now going to analyze the causes of the Great Depression and how effective the government's responses were by 1932. The engineer, Herbert Hoover, was elected president in 1928. Herbert Hoover had made a fortune as a mining engineer. He was kind of one of those rags to riches story, right? And he seemed destined for a successful presidency. He had made his fortune in the private industry. In World War I, he headed the Food Administration with a great degree of success. Under the Harding administration, he was the Secretary of Commerce. So he seemed poised to, kind of do a good job. And Hoover considered himself a progressive, but he did not favor government intervention in the economy. Hoover argued that self-interest should be subordinated to public service, so in that he was like the progressives, but he was against the government doing it. Instead, he favored what he called associational action, and by that he meant private agencies would be regulating themselves, and that this stuff would be kind of voluntary. Now, Hoover is going to accept the Republican nomination, and he'll be facing off against his Democratic opponent, a man named Alfred E. Smith. Al Smith was a 3-time governor of New York, and he, celebrated, Smith was Catholic, and that became a major issue in the campaign, especially in the South, which was virulently anti-Catholic during the time period. And Smith kind of framed himself as the spokesman for that new immigrant, the spokesman for tolerance, the spokesman for, kind of this new vision of American freedom and toleration. But it's not going to fly, particularly in the South. And so for the first time since Reconstruction, a Republican carried Southern states, and Hoover is elected by a landslide, largely because of this prejudice against Catholic Americans. So Hoover comes in, and things are going fine, right? On October 21st, 1929, for example, Hoover gives this big speech where he's paying tribute to progress and talking about prosperity. And then 8 days later is Black Tuesday. Black Tuesday is when the stock market crashed, and stocks will lose $10 billion in market value in 5 hours. Today, that number would be 10 times that amount, right? And I mean, it was just epic. Oh my God, it just crashed down on everybody's head. Now, the stock market crash did not by itself cause the depression. Most Americans didn't own stock. But it came with such severity that it destroyed the confidence of many businesses and consumers. And a lot of our economy runs on confidence. If you think that that your job is secure, that you're going to have a job next year, you might go out and buy a new car, right? But if you think that you might lose your job any day, you are not going to go out and buy a new car. Well, guess what? If I think I'm going to have my job, I'm going to go out and buy a car, that means car companies are doing good. If I'm worried about my job, I'm not, that means car companies are doing bad. So guess what? Then their workers start losing jobs. So now I'm even more scared. Am I going to lose my job? So even more workers lose job, and it kind of spirals. So this crisis in confidence is a really big deal. The global financial system was ill-equipped to deal with this crash. By this time, the global economy is pretty tied together. In the stock market crash in America is going to reverberate around the world. London had already had a stock market crash a few days earlier. Germany is struggling with reparations payments. They're defaulting on their loans. They've got runaway inflation. We begin to see banks fail, not just in the United States, but all across the world. And so by 1932, the economy had hit rock bottom, and 25% of the United States labor force was out of work. So if you need to pause this video to catch up on something, you may do so now. So the Great Depression is going to transform American life, and the way that Americans were thinking about poverty and thinking about why people were poor and thinking about what it means to be American all get shaken, challenged, and transformed because of the Great Depression. We will begin to see bread lines in cities. This is when people would line up around the block to get a charity meal because there was no food. We saw homelessness explode, and you saw shanty towns like the one pictured there pop up, and they were derisively called Hoovervilles after Hoover because he's getting the blame for this. Suicide rates skyrocket. They become the highest in the nation's history, and birth rates become the lowest in the nation's history. So people are killing themselves and people are not having kids. And today, in fact, suicide rates are also incredibly high, and birth rates are down among all groups except for women in their 40s, ironically, but everybody else is having less children as well. So we see echoes in today's world with the conditions similar to the Great Depression. During the Great Depression, many Americans are going to be migrating out of the cities because there are no jobs, and instead moving into rural areas, many with the idea of simply being able to grow food to try to feed their families. And as a result of this, that image of big business, which had been kind of carefully cultivated during the 1920s as big business being good and benevolent and a good thing and capitalism is the best, all of that collapses because as congressional investigations begin looking into what happened here, it revealed kind of these massive bad dealings and corruption among bankers, among stockbrokers, among big business. And kind of this full spread of corruption and unfairness is exposed. And you're a lot less willing to look the other way if you're living in a Hooverville. If you're living in, your 3-bedroom house with your white picket fence and your 2.5 kids and your dog and your car, and you're like, look, corruption, you're not as concerned about it as if you're living in a Hooverville, you've lost everything, and then you start looking for somebody to blame. And to be fair, they were to blame. So many Americans are going to kind of feel resigned to this, right? There's this sense of many people give up, and there's also this anger, right, and this despair that takes place across the country. Additionally, there's also protest, but the protest during the Great Depression is going to be largely unorganized. The reason why is because the traditional groups that would have helped mobilize this anger and mobilize this protest, things like labor unions, have been crushed in the 1920s. So, for example, the Socialist Party, which would be, a logical kind of protest place that Americans could have turned, by this point had been decimated. You do see some semi-organized protests, for example, the Bonus March. This was when 20,000 unemployed World War I veterans descended on Washington, D.C. in the spring of 1932. They were demanding an early payment of a bonus that they were promised that was due in 1945, arguing, hey, I need my bonus now, my family's starving. And they set up Hoovervilles in Washington, D.C. They brought their families, and Hoover says no and actually sends out the United States military to burn their shanty town down. And, led by heroes of World War II, right? Eisenhower's there, MacArthur's there. And news cameras captured it all. When FDR reportedly saw the film of the U.S. Army burning these veterans out of their Hooverville, he famously looked at his aide and said, I've just won the election, right? Because this went over like a ton of lead bricks. You also had the National Farmers Holiday Association, formed by Milo Reno. This was an organization that protested low prices by temporarily blocking roads in the Midwest, trying to prevent farm goods from getting to market. That, too, is going to go nowhere. Really, the only kind of semi-effective protest organization is the minuscule Communist Party that is still kind of floating around during this time period. It seemed to be the only organ effective to give political focus to the anger and despair most Americans felt. It formed unemployment councils, it held marches and demonstrations for public assistance, it protested evictions, it provided legal aid. But it's so small, it's a drop in the bucket. And so most people are feeling pretty hopeless. So if you need to pause this video, you can do so now. So at first, Hoover is thinking that this will blow over. The economy, capitalist economies are famous for booms and busts, right? You go up and then you crash down and then you go up again. So he's not doing much of anything. His advisors claim that downturns were normal in capitalism, that they were actually good because they weeded out unproductive firms, that they would be encouraging moral virtue, right? People would have to choose, do I really want to go to the movies or should I stay home and, I don't know, read the Bible, whatever. And businessmen were also strongly opposed to federal aid to unemployed people. The argument, of course, was this will make them dependent, but the reality is, well, if I know that I'm not going to starve to death, then maybe I'm not going to work for just anything, right? So Hoover doesn't do much of anything. But by the time 25% of the country is out of work, when 1 out of every 4 people are homeless, or not homeless, but out of work, Hoover's response seemed completely inadequate and completely out of touch. And honestly, the federal government had never faced such a severe economic crisis in all its history. It did not seem to understand how big the problem was, and it also didn't seem to have understood how consumer culture had changed American culture and had changed American expectations. There was this kind of failure to understand consumer spending's importance in how Americans not just lived, but how they identified themselves. And nevertheless, the government's still going to be continuing to worry that direct aid would, quote, weaken the sturdiness of our national character. So Hoover is going to remain committed to what he called associational action. In other words, that he initially tries to get businesses to voluntarily band together to try to get out of the Depression. And he would go out there and he understood that part of the economy runs on confidence. So he'd go out there and say things like the tide has turned and things are getting better. He would famously hold these newsreels where he's like sitting down in front of a giant feast because he's trying to show the country, hey, we're prosperous still, right? But this totally backfires. To people, it looked like he was completely out of touch. And of course, associational action, while it might have worked in World War I, the Great Depression was a completely different animal, and that was doing nothing too. And so, despite these early actions, the economic situation just kept getting worse and worse. And indeed, some of the administration's remedies made things worse. Case in point was the Smoot-Hawley tariff. The Smoot-Hawley tariff is going to raise the tariff to some of the highest levels ever. And the reason why this hurt was because one of the reasons why the Great Depression is sinking in is because of underconsumption. People are not buying things. So if you made cars and you have 50 cars sitting in your warehouse and nobody's buying them, you're going to start laying off workers. You're not going to keep making cars that are not selling until you sell the cars that you have. Well, if you lay off workers, they're not going to buy cars either. So it spirals. So ideally, what you would do in the situation is if you can't sell your cars in America, you would sell them overseas. And so the Smoot-Hawley tariff, the thinking of it was that this would make Americans buy American products, and that would help businesses and help pull us out of the Depression. But Americans aren't buying goods because American goods because they're more expensive. They aren't buying any goods because they don't have any money. And so the rule of tariffs is, this is just how it works, and look at any trade war in history, that as soon as you put a tariff on a country, they will turn around and slap the same tariff on you, right? If you put a $1 tariff on me, I'm going to put a $1 tariff on you. That's just how it works. And so when the United States passes this tariff, other countries respond by passing high tariffs against United States products. So now these businesses cannot sell their extra cars overseas because they're artificially really expensive. And so this makes things worse. So finally, by the time we get to 1932, Hoover realizes that he has to do something. As the crisis deepened, he realized that his previous actions are not cutting it. And so in 1932, Hoover created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation loaned money to banks, to railroads, to other businesses. Again, only providing help to business, not to individual people, because they're afraid of dependency. So be careful when you hear them talk about government handouts. It means, they don't mean government handouts are bad in general, they just mean it for individuals, right? He also created the Federal Home Loan Bank System. This offered aid to homeowners who were threatened with foreclosure, but it's kind of small and not very effective. And so all of this is a dramatic departure from previous economic policy where the federal government was kind of staying out of it. That being said, he had vetoed a previous public works bill that was aimed at putting people to work who had lost their jobs. Though he does begin some public works, he reversed course and now approved $2 billion in initiative and local relief efforts, for example, the Hoover Dam. This is how this gets built. So he is starting to kind of change his mind on public works, but he's still vehemently opposed to offering direct relief to the unemployed, offering things like unemployment insurance or food assistance or housing assistance or anything like that. And again, it's because of those social Darwinistic fears of dependency, right? This idea that if I just give you money, you're never going to get a job. Of course, the problem with this was in the Great Depression, there were no jobs, right? 25% of the country didn't immediately decide, well, I just think I'm going to be lazy and lay on the government dole, right? And so this definition of freedom now starts to shift. Because in 1927, the definition of freedom that was the most celebrated kind of celebrated this unimpeded reign of economic enterprise. And so it was kind of hands-off business, kind of this laissez-faire, and yet it tolerated the surveillance of private life, of regulating morality, and all of this kind of comes discredited because of the Great Depression. By 1932, we're now seeing the seeds being sown for a new concept of freedom. And the new concept of freedom that is beginning to emerge in the 1930s is this combination of two elements that are kind of existing uneasily together. The first was this progressive belief in a socially conscious state making constructive changes in economic arrangements. The idea that the government has a responsibility to take a role in the economy, especially in making sure that the less powerful workers and people are being protected. And in kind of an easy alliance with that was also this new respect for civil liberties and for cultural pluralism. So if you need to pause this video to catch up on something, you may do so now. So in this lecture, we identified who benefited and who suffered in the new consumer society of the 1920s. We identified in what ways the government promoted business interests in the 1920s. We analyzed why the protection of civil liberties gained importance in the 1920s. We explained the major flashpoints between fundamentalism and pluralism in the 20s. And finally, we analyzed the causes of the Great Depression and how effective the government's responses were by 1932.